Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. Well, you see there's a pool noodle behind me. And at about 10 seconds into the video, you're probably wondering, Outlaw, why is this pool noodle not cut? Well, there's actually a reason for that. The reason being, on why this pool noodle isn't cut, is because we're actually going to do kind of a throwback review. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, Outlaw, what the hell are you talking about, throwback review? Well, if you remember, a few years ago I did the unboxing and review of this, the Cold Steel Italian longsword. And I made a video of this, but I didn't post it because, well, I deleted it. Partially on accident, partially because I just hated the cutting footage of this thing. Now, Outlaw Knight loves this longsword, and he's able to make it work, but for me, for the life of me, I've never been able to really cut with this. I've gotten a couple of cuts, but I've just never been able to make this thing work for me. It is the only sword that I have never been able to really get what I consider to be decent cuts with. And it's partially due to blade geometry, and also probably has something to do with the fact that I have no idea how to actually use this sword in the same proper techniques that it was originally created to be used with. But we're going to be doing a throwback review. Now, why am I doing this? Well, Gargoyle has recently been doing these videos of him going back with his old swords after a while, and I realized that once I do the initial unboxing, review, and cutting videos for these swords, honestly, I don't ever think I did a cutting video for this. Well, I think I did a cutting video / Halloween special for this, or something like that. But I realized I never actually go back and talk about the swords after the fact. So this is the Cold Steel Italian Longsword Man-at-Arms edition. It's the Man-at-Arms edition because it's solid black. Black grip, black pommel, black grip, black guard, black blade, black pommel, black, blackety, black, blackjack, as Matthew Jensen would say. This sword, in its very design, lends itself well to thrusting techniques and even half swording. It's not so much a cutting geometry. But let's see if we can't actually get a cut on this. Now this thing will basically, the only thing I've ever been able to cut is those really, really thin plastic bottles, like the ice mountains and such. But I'm wondering if I can do it with the pool noodle. Now, you generally want to cut at the center of percussion, which is roughly here, and that's where the blade really starts to taper to a fine point. I don't know exactly the typology of this longsword, to be honest. I haven't really studied oak shot or European typologies much. But I do know one thing, that this is a thrust-oriented blade. And it does superiorly well on thrusts and hard targets that the blade really has no choice but to bite into. I don't have any specs on me at this time, I'll look up the specs and I'll like splice the specs in at the end of the video. But without further ado, don'ts and probably shouldn'ts, let's get started. I'm going to attempt to do a cut from Wrathguard. And Wrath is such like this. And see how well that works. If it doesn't work well, I'll switch over to finger over the guard grip. Now, this section of the blade is blunt from my finger down to the guard, so I'm not concerned with cutting myself. If you look, most historical swords that you'll find in a museum don't actually start to have a sharp edge until the latter half of the blade. Because up here is where you're going to be doing your cutting with really any sword. And down here really doesn't need to be sharp, because it's for blocking and parrying. So let's see how well Wrathguard cuts. I'm going to be honest with you, if I actually cut this pool noodle, I'm going to be quite surprised. Okay. I did not expect that to happen. That I expected to happen. That I expected to happen. Even something like that. Now, I believe that when I was striking, I was actually striking much lower down here on the blade where it's wider than up here where it's narrower, because up here it's pretty much blunt. Down here it has a relatively good edge. So let me just test that theory. I'm going to cut right here. Well, my theory is uncontested. Ah, I see. Here's the center of percussion. Right here. This is the sweet spot for cutting with this sword. Between where my finger is, where my thumb is, and here. I'd even argue that you could probably get away with extending the sweet spot of the cold steel Italian longsword up to about here to here. Well, it's definitely not conclusive enough to do upper slashes and such. But at least now we know that it was my fault all this time for not realizing where the sweet spot on this sword lies. But for it to be a truly conclusive kind of revisit, we'll have to cut the quote-unquote bane of this sword's cutting career, which is water bottles. So I'm going to pause the video while we go back into the outlaw shrine, as it was. because the secret garden, which is this area right here, a little noisy in the middle of the day. So we shall be right back. Now the camera is setting far back because I have to cut relatively low on this, and there's a high chance of it sending bottles everywhere, so I want my camera in a safe place. Check to see if the now you may have noticed that I brought out the old Warrior O katana as well. And zoom out for a minute. That's because I want to do two cuts. A controlled cut that I know will work with the Warrior O versus the underlying variable that is the longsword. I know that the Warrior O will go through any of the bottles I put it up against. But the longsword is a different story. Since I have just recently found out where its sweet spot lies, I want to kind of toy around a little bit. Put the longsword over here for a moment. Now to make this test fair and comparable, I'm going to be using bottles that even the Warrior O has proven to have difficulties with in the past, and these are these prime energy drink bottles. This isn't going to be highly scientific or anything of that nature, but I am trying to get the best results possible. First, the control test with the Warrior O. Three, two, one. As we saw, the Warrior O sent the bottle flying. But with relative ease, it did cut it. I might have to actually go back in and resharpen the blade of the Warrior O, because my stropping, the honing belt I've been using to keep this thing sharp, is kind of worn out. But I do believe that the edges are comparable. Now we'll move on to the longsword. Again, here is the sweet spot. I'm going to be cutting from here downwards. So I'm going to be relatively close to this bottle. 3, 2, 1. Well, something clearly happened here. For admittedly, I shut my eyes halfway through it. So I guess we'll see it on camera. I have one more prime bottle that we can use for test. And I know I only did one cut with the Warrior O, but then again, the Warrior O is there for just the comparison. The true thing we are testing is the cutting ability of the longsword. Huh. So even though I have to stand ridiculously close, I can cut it. Now, some of you may be wondering, Outlaw, if you have to stand that close to cut something, then shouldn't you just, at that point, not even bother with the long sword, just get yourself a short sword or a dagger? And you would be right. If I have to stand so ridiculously close to cut something, that would be a bad thing. But here's another thing that we need to consider about this type of sword. Sorry, I don't have my suspenders on. That being the fact that this sword, by its very blade shape, is not conclusive to being a strong cutter. Its true performance comes in when we consider that this sword was from the early, this sword design in general was from the early 14th century to roughly mid 15th to late 16th centuries. That's the Renaissance era. And that is an era where there were many more knights, man-at-arms, and common soldiers in general that had access to not only the chainmail and gambeson used prior to the Renaissance, but also full-plate armor became generally more available to the common soldier. So you had more than just the nobility and knights in full-plate armor. You had men-at-arms, which were rallied soldiers, which were fighters and warriors and rallied soldiers hired by lords to supplement their fighting forces. You had mercenaries. You had farm boys being drafted and basically given a spear, a helmet, and some chainmail. And even some maybe gauntlets and full plate armor to go along with it if they prove themselves. But in any case, in the 16th century, from the 13th to 16th century, plate armor became more widely used and available, generally speaking. So sword makers were like, well, obviously our swords can't cut through steel armor. And obviously the old style of having a cut and thrust combination blade was working, but what happens when you go up against plate armor that you can't cut? The simplest solution was to make the blades narrower and pointier so that in turn they could stab in between the plates of armor where there would be natural gaps where there are joints. Stabbing into the armpit for one. Stabbing into your elbow joints for another. Behind the knees, into the groin. Right? These places were targets that you needed a nimble sword with plenty of point control to get into. And when you think about this, even when I'm doing just these half-ass thrusts, the point of this sword is going exactly where I'm thrusting at. So it does have tremendous tip and point control. However, because of its thrusting capability and its point control and its tip control, its cutting performance was gradually diminished as compensation for that thrusting ability. This will get in between the plates, in between plate armor and chainmail, far more effectively than this Okatana blade will. Now, if you're fighting against an opponent that doesn't have chainmail and doesn't have gambeson, the Okatana will definitely cut through the gambeson far more effectively than the longsword. And I know this is sort of becoming longsword versus katana, and I'm not meaning for this to happen, but we are comparing just these two swords. We are looking back on this one, but I need to add context here. That this blade shape was developed to fight against armor. This blade shape was developed to fight against mostly unarmored to heavily light. Well, I don't mean heavily armored. I mean heavily lightly armored, and that means the majority of troops that this sword fought were lightly armored, mostly wearing layers upon layers of cloth, and maybe like wood, because there is historical wooden samurai armor, laminated armor, where there's little steel plates sewn to a leather where there's little metal plates sewn to a larger plate of leather that this sword could get in between the little metal plates, stab through the leather and into somebody. But yes, if I was going to be fighting against somebody, yeah, and that again is where this Italian version of the longsword comes into play. Now that I have found out that because it's not a bad cutter because of its blade, generally, it does still possess the ability to cut. It's bad because I haven't understood that. Most of my sword swinging background, this was the third sword I ever bought. I had owned two katana up until that point, the crane and the orchid katana. And I had tremendous cutting ability, tremendous ability to cut with the katana. And I thought that, oh, this longsword is going to be the same way. I was looking for a longsword. $200 seemed cheap in comparison to a lot of other shit that I had been looking at the time. So I was like, cool, great. And then I was like, I tried cutting with this thing, and I tried cutting with this thing. And it really only worked against thick tree branches for the longest time. Then Outlaw Knight was able to cut with this thing, and I was like, okay, there is something I'm doing wrong here. Then I started to really deep dive into longsword, and I kind of set the whole like learning longsword thing to the side for a while because I kept looking at other swords and I kept finding more information about swords. Then I bought then I bought my first Dao, and then I bought a Kriegsmesser and a Viking sword, and all the way down the road. And the Viking sword is really what reignited my interest in the whole double-edged sword thing. Because personally, I don't really like double-edged swords because they're not silhouettely appealing to me. Alright? I find that single-edged swords just have more advantages in combat, especially if you have to push off with your opposite hand before you can, like, institute a grapple. I would not want to just casually bash my hand into a double-edged sword blade. Hence why I prefer single blade. But in any case, now that I have given this sword a full, honest chance, I must say that for its blade, for the shape of the blade itself, it's not that bad. But my own lack of experience and, I want to say, ignorance has kind of made me have a bad view of this sword, in my opinion. And for that, I am sorry to the sword. But now that I've figured out what I've been doing wrong in cutting with this thing, because what I've been doing wrong is I've been trying to cut with this upper half like you do with a katana, and that's wrong. This particular blade geometry bodes well for cutting lower on the blade where it's wider. Right? This narrow tip is very much a thrust-oriented formation. So with that in mind,